Golden Valley Human Rights Commission. And thank you all for showing up for tonight's event. Discussion about restorative vote, brought to you by the ACLU Minnesota, sponsored by City Golden Valley Human Rights Commission, also New Hope Human Rights Commission, and also League of Women Voters, Golden Valley, New Hope. Sorry? Okay. It's been a long day, sorry. But thank you for being here. As part of the Human Rights Commission for Golden Valley, one of our goals is to bring information to the community about issues that face underserved populations, issues that people face in this community every day. And one of those issues right now, especially this election year, is about voting rights and understanding that people know what the rights are, and for people who may not know what the rights are and what challenges they may face. And so we invited the ACLU to give a talk about one issue that kind of is in the mainstream about felons' rights to vote after they are released from prison. Many don't know that they can vote in the state of Minnesota, and so part of the ACLU's mission and goal to change a lot, make it easier for people to understand what their rights are. So enough of me talking, let the experts do it. Jana Kooren is one of the speakers, who is the Public Education and Communication Director for the ACLU Minnesota chapter, who focuses on the issues such as restoration of voting rights. And then Elizer Darris, who also be speaking with her as well. He's been kind of through the ringer in a sense, and so he will give his perspective and also some additional information. Again, thank you for being here, and without further ado, Jana.
Hi, if this microphone's not working, the person over there can tell me. Are you gonna stay over there? Yeah. In case you want to jump in. So thank you so much for having us. I'm happy to be here to talk to you a little about voting rights restoration. I definitely also want to let you know I'll welcome any questions. So if you have any questions at any point, feel free to raise your hand. At any time during the talk, we'll also save some questions for the end. But if there's a burning question you have right away, you can feel free to chime in and ask it right away. So first of all, just to make sure it's clear what we're talking about, felon disenfranchisement is the removal of voting rights from those who've been convicted of a felony. And in Minnesota, the current law bars anyone who's currently on probation or parole from voting, which means you can have finished your time in jail or prison if you have that as part of your felony sentence, but be living in the community, and as a term of your probation, parole, or conditional release, you're not eligible to vote until you finish all of that, which means you can have people who are living in the community but unable to vote for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Once your probation, parole, or conditional release, or it's also called going off paper, once you're officially off paper, then your right to vote is automatically restored. So that's the way the law currently works in Minnesota, and it's been that way for quite a while. The Minnesota Constitution, when it was written, initially said that, or the Minnesota Constitution specified that you are not restored to your right to vote until basically until after your civil rights have been restored. So it's like your vote to vote is taken away until your civil rights have been restored. But it didn't really specify what it meant by when your civil rights are restored. Because when the Minnesota Constitution was written, there was no system of probation, parole, or conditional release, which means that there is room to improve the law. Not only, and we wouldn't have to do it through a constitutional amendment, we'd basically have to decide, well, when is it time for your rights to be restored? The ACLU is part of a coalition with a lot of other organizations that is working to change the law so we can make it as soon as you are released from custody, if you are serving time behind bars. And not everyone serving a felony sentence actually even goes to prison. But once you are living in the community, your right to vote is automatically restored. So that's kind of just what we're briefly pushing for. Now, disenfranchisement across the country. So nationwide, around 6 million citizens can no longer vote due to a felony conviction, right? And that's a huge voting block. If you think of any election, right, everyone in this room probably has voted or wants to vote if they're eligible, or votes regularly in their lifetime if they're here, right? Because you all are tied with groups that care about things like that. And when you think about elections, what difference would 6 million votes have made in the last election? A huge difference, right? And I'm not saying even for one party or the other, but historically we also know who are the most likely to be disenfranchised. How many people in this room have read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow? Anyone? Okay, if you haven't heard of it, I would definitely recommend reading it. She walks through the history of voter disenfranchisement laws. And while in Minnesota, it's true that our disenfranchisement law was written when the Constitution was, many voter disenfranchisement laws are deciding when a felon can no longer vote happened during a time where it was clear it was used to suppress the African American vote, right? Or to suppress people of color, people we are no more likely to be incarcerated because of the institutionalized racism in our country. So when you look at a broad cross-section of the states, every state is different. There's nothing in our federal constitution that bars people from voting with a felony conviction. Nothing in our federal constitution. It is completely different state by state. So for example, in Maine and Vermont, you can vote while you're in prison. You never lose your right to vote in Maine and Vermont. Then you have a whole group of states that are voting rights restored upon release from incarceration. That includes states like North Dakota, right next to us, New York, Hawaii, Illinois, Indiana, Utah, California, Colorado. There's a lot of states. Around 14 states have it where you're restored upon release. So that's what Minnesota, that's what we want to achieve here. Then there's a whole group of states where we're kind of in the middle of. States like Alaska, Arkansas, Georgia, Idaho, Iowa, Wisconsin, West Virginia that are like us. You don't get your voting rights restored until after you finish all terms of your sentence. And then you have a group of states where you're potentially permanently disenfranchised. And these are the states where you might hear some of the most horror stories from, or I should say you hear talked about the most. You have, those include states like Florida, Alabama, Kentucky, Mississippi. You'll notice a lot of them are in the South, right? Virginia, a lot of places that had slavery, a lot of places that were trying to do what they could to suppress the African American vote. But it's not just located in the South, though. We have Delaware, we have Wyoming. We do have states and other places around the country where you can permanently lose it. And in those states, sometimes you can try to petition to get your voting rights restored. In other states, you can't. So we really have a broad cross-section of different voting laws in different states, which makes it incredibly confusing for the average voter. Right? So you could, for example, if you have a felony conviction, you would be in Florida, told you can never vote again. You could move to another state and find out you're never voting because you were told you can't vote, and you move to another state and all of a sudden you're eligible to vote, which makes it very confusing. And when we are talking to folks in the community, we find time and time again that they don't actually know what the law is. They don't know when they're eligible, if they're eligible, or anything like that. So it makes it challenging for voters, or potentially eligible voters, to know when and if they're eligible because of this kind of this incredible different landscape we have across the country. So in Minnesota, for example, we've even had a case. This is a case that ACLU had taken a while ago, where someone committed a felony in Florida. Once they were off paper in Florida, they were eligible to move, so they relocated to Minnesota. They tried to cast a ballot, and they actually had a lawsuit filed against them by the county attorneys in a county in southern Minnesota saying you're ineligible to vote because we should apply Florida's law standards to you here in Minnesota. So because your conviction happened in Florida and that state permanently bars you, we shouldn't allow you to vote here in Minnesota. Now, luckily, we won this case. Right, but we'll see where these problems and this very negative, reaction that so many folks are having for allowing people to vote. And I think this idea that it has to be a part of who we are and it has to be a part of our country really doesn't even make sense when you see how many different rules and how many different restrictions there are, or lack of restrictions there are, in states across the country. So I mentioned this before, as the fact that racial disparities and racism were a huge part of why a number of these voting laws were passed, or these anti-felon voting laws were passed in the South. But even here, in northern Minnesota, I'm sure, or in the north in Minnesota, I'm sure a lot of you know as well have heard that we still have incredible racial disparities in our criminal justice system here. So right now, we have roughly at any given point 63,000 people who are a part of the Department of Corrections in some way, either in prison, probation, parole, or conditional release. The numbers incarcerated currently in Minnesota are roughly around 10,000 people. It kind of varies between like a little under 10 and 11,000 depending on, the day, the year. It fluctuates a little bit. And roughly we have 51,000 Minnesotans who are living in the community and ineligible to vote. Of those 51,000, about 64% live outside of the core metro area in Hennepin or Ramsey County. So around 35,000 of them are white, 12,000 are African American, 3,000 are Latino, and 3,000 are Native Americans. If you look at the population of Minnesota and compare that, though, African Americans and Native Americans are much more likely to be disenfranchised than white Minnesotans. So even though the numbers, even though it's not as drastic as in other states, because we're not disenfranchising millions in Minnesota, we are still disenfranchising African Americans 7 times more likely and Native Americans about 5 times more likely. So we still have huge disproportionate impact on people of color here in Minnesota because of a lot of the problems we have in our criminal justice system. When Minnesota was first founded as a state, we had something like, 40 felonies total. And that number has grown by, there were 71 felony crimes, and that number has rose by about 400% in the 70s. So right now we have 350 felony crimes today that you can be convicted of. So you can see when the Constitution was written and when people kind of pictured what that meant to what it's actually like today, it's impacting a much wider variety and a lot more people than the writers of our Constitution kind of originally even were picturing. So it has a wide-ranging impact, or we can see a large number of people. I think a lot of people also, especially because of the problems with racial disparities, think of this as really an urban problem, right? That the most people are impacted are people who live in, a big city, where it's where all the crime is. But when you have 64% of the people who are impacted who are living outside of that core metro area, those are suburban, rural districts, you can see that this is impacting a lot of folks, right? These are impacting folks who have, we know that there's a lot of talk about the opioid crisis, right? And these are people who are our friends, who are our neighbors, who are living in the community, and who are just ready to be able to kind of participate more in society. One of the things about disenfranchisement, it is actually shown to have no positive benefits. If we really believe in a criminal justice system that is supposed to rehabilitate and is supposed to make somebody ready to fully participate and live in society, then we should look at what are we doing that's actually going to make that happen, right? And rehabilitation is what most people want out of the criminal justice system, not just a punitive system, right? You want people to be ready to work, to move on with their lives, to do everything. And one of the key things of doing that is to encourage positive participation and encourage people to really enact and be engaged in their communities. And when you deny somebody the right to vote, when you take that away, not only does it impact that person's ability to feel connected and part of the community, it's also been shown that it can have effects down the line, because if your parents don't vote, or if the parents don't vote, kids are less likely to vote, right? And so you're passing this along generationally. You're not just harming the current people who are incarcerated, you're harming their families and you're harming their communities. Right? So it's mothers who aren't able to vote for their kids' school board elections, right? It's people who, has a historical election of electing the first African-American president, or the first, potentially, for people who were excited about voting for Clinton, the first female president, who don't get to participate in those moments. And when it's shown to have no positive benefits and nothing good is happening from it, it's only punitive. The ACLU and others are really pushing the legislature to be like, well, why do we need this? That's not what our system should be about. We should be wanting about encouraging positive participation, increasing activism, increasing voter turnout, and making sure that we give as much opportunity to really allow for a more restorative, rehabilitative practice across the state. So that's just kind of a brief overview of the problem with felon disenfranchisement, not only across the country, but here a little bit in Minnesota. I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Eli, to talk a little bit more about, she'll share with you what he wants to talk about.
Hey, thank you, Jana. phenomenal communicator, director of communications for ACLU, my boss at the ACLU. I run the Smart Justice campaign for the ACLU. What we're trying to do is basically help educate individuals about the power and the role of the prosecutor within communities, but beyond that, just educate people in general about the importance of elections, the importance of voting, down balloting voting as well. This includes county sheriff, this includes county commissioners, not the glamorous campaigns, but likely the campaigns that have the most immediate impact on the quality of our lives. And so we have door knocking teams, we have phone banking teams, we are looking for volunteers, anyone who would like to be part of that. We are going directly out into community, having conversations after brief trainings so that people are prepared to be able to have some of those discussions. And oftentimes, what you're going to find is people are going to offload years of pent-up frustrations about the criminal justice system, the face of it, and the impacts that it's having within communities. And so that's kind of what I do with the ACLU. And as part of what we do is help to push certain initiatives. And one of the initiatives that we're pushing is the Restore the Vote initiative. Before I became part of ACLU, I was a consultant and I was kind of doing a lot of speaking and a lot of moving around. And one of the organizers that the ACLU brought on to help organize and push this particular initiative right here, she asked me to come to the meetings and lend my voice as a person who has been affected and as a person who currently cannot vote. And so I came and I watched how the committee interacted with itself, and I was intrigued. The prospect of all of the hard work that I do turning into an actual vote at the end was very alluring. And so I became part of this coalition before I became employed by the ACLU. And I was really impressed, and I still am really impressed with what we do. Most of my angst and what really led me to join this particular coalition, it's a really widespread coalition too that actually crosses party lines, was how intentional it was and how uncompromising it was with regard to saying, no, we are going to go full-fledged, restoring the vote, not restoring some of the vote, but restoring all of the vote or none of the vote. And so I really like that intentionality. I like that intensity, and it made me want to just stick around and, put in more work on behalf of this particular initiative. What informs that is the fact that, here I was door knocking for various different candidates across the Twin Cities. When I was first released from incarceration, I became part of a congressional campaign going up against Eric Paulson. Her name was Terry Bonoff. She was running for Congress. I was one of her field ops. And, I've knocked hundreds and hundreds of doors and engaged in hundreds of conversations trying to convince people to get out of the house and go and door knock. Get out of the house. You can tell that I'm field ops. Get out of the house and go and vote. How critical and how important this election was. And, I got a lot of lackluster response during this time. I don't think people took the gravity of the moment into, full apprehension. And so, what we found in 2016, I think really shocked us with regard to what the results were. And I think that really electrified a lot of people, and that really galvanized a lot of people to be able to want to do more. And I found that my voice was really strengthened through electioneering. And so I continued to work in it, I continued to study it, I continued to learn more about it, and I ended up being part of another mayoral campaign. And I almost said Anika. Nikema Levy-Pounds, she changed her name, so I'm still trying to get used to the new name. It's Armstrong now. Nikema Levy-Pounds was running for mayor of Minneapolis, and I said, yes, I would definitely be part of your campaign. I am totally with everything that you stand for. I have been following you for many years, and I'm certainly a supporter. And here I found myself, her director of field operations, now looking at all 13 wards in Minneapolis, now putting together field teams, going and knocking all of those doors, or as many as we could, running phone banks, doing volunteer recruitment and organizing volunteers. And yet, at the end of all of that, I still could not vote. Now, instead of hundreds, I've likely knocked thousands of doors and pushed thousands of people to the polls, and I could not vote. It was such a strange quandary that I found myself in. You know, the desire to have that same little red sticker that I was pushing all of these other people to go out and do. I'm knocking in negative 10-degree weather, having conversations at people's doors, trying to convince them of how critical it was for them to vote, how important their voice mattered in this particular election. And I couldn't vote. It was really frustrating, and it still is frustrating, because I also found myself being beholden to all of the laws, all of the rules, all of the restrictions and guidelines that are voted upon by people who are elected, and I have zero say in them. But when the law is created, the expectation is that I abide by it. Never mind that no taxation, representation, and all of that stuff, founding fathers, all that. The expectation is that I abide by it while not having any say in how it's crafted. It's yet another strange situation that I find myself in. And so my energy, and I won't be able to vote for another 7 years. There are some people who won't be able to vote for 10, 20, 30 years. One of the other initiatives that the ACLU and other organizations are taking on is looking to see how we can reduce the amount of time that people are being placed on probation or parole. The prosecutors utilize this bargaining chip. It's a strong chip, because you find yourself in the county jail, and it's a horrible, horrible existence in the county jail. Many people actually prefer to be in a penitentiary or actual state prison than a county jail. It's really rough in there. And so you find yourself faced with the prospect of, fighting the case for another, 3 months, losing your job, losing your car, losing your woman potentially, and losing your dog, or take this deal for 10 years probation, we'll kick you out tomorrow. Take this deal for 20 years probation and, don't do anything else and we'll kick you out tomorrow. I mean, when you're looking at that, I think we're going to leave just a smidget of time for Q&A too. I see the question in your eyes. But when you're looking at that, people take the deal. I mean, it makes sense to take the deal because, you have a whole life that's on the line here. For whatever you did do, you're thinking to yourself, what's 10 years of probation? What's 20 years of probation? I get out tomorrow. Now, what you're not recognizing is, you can give up on all that voting. That's done, all right, for another 2 decades. 2 decades down the line, you'll be able to vote again. And so, there's a lot of conversation, and I'm glad that we're at the tables helping to spearhead this conversation with regard to putting a cap on the amount of time that an individual is on probation or parole. 20 years is excessive. You can actually help to project what a person's potential of recidivism or recidivating would be after X amount of years in either physical or non-physical custody. So we already know that people after 5 years, the probability of that person recidivating is extraordinarily low. And so 10 years is excessive. 15 years is abusive. 20 years is likely unconstitutional. It's likely cruel and unusual. And so we are actually doing things to help to reduce in Minnesota the time that people are spending on probation or parole. We recognize that as being a basic civil liberty interest and an issue, and I'm glad that we're involved in that. I'm glad that I'm able to be at the tip of the spear with regard to opening up elections for all people to be fully civically engaged. I don't even see how it makes any sense in any way, any shape, or any form to tell someone who is attempting to fully engage in the democratic experience to say, no, don't, sit on the sidelines, be in the shadows. And I'll briefly talk about another initiative that we did, and it really coincides with what we're doing now. We also helped to spearhead in Hennepin and Ramsey County the Warrant Resolution or the Warrant Forgiveness Days. These were individuals who were in the shadows, who had warrants, who would, for whatever reason, didn't come forward and face whatever those warrants were, whether it was losing employment, whether it was losing their freedom, whatever it was, whether it was a hefty fine that was just, massive and it compounds as time goes on. And so now you're looking at a 10-year-old warrant for driving without licensure or whatever it was. It's compounding and it's getting larger and it's weighing more. And so the initiative was to say, come forward, come out of the shadows, come into the daylight and get your life restored. Get in front of a judge, plead guilty. In Hennepin County's case, we had some community service for you to do. But come forward and become part of this process again. Because we recognize that we have a basic interest in opening up this experience for people to come out of the shadows and to live this shared life that we have. It's pretty basic to me, and so the same, if it's true for that, to me, the same is also true for voting. We have an interest in having people fully engage in this democratic experience. And so that's what we're doing at the ACLU. That's part of what we're doing with the restorative vote. And we're doing a couple other things, but in a nutshell, that's kind of what's going on there. So I think...
Yeah, I'll have a couple more things. Well, we can do some questions, and I can go on to talk a little bit about what's happening at the Capitol now with the bill. But yeah, go ahead. We'll do some questions.
The question is, have you ever gone to the point, have you ever advocated for full enfranchisement from the time, through prison and everything?
The ACLU does support full enfranchisement. We would definitely support having you vote while you're in prison. We don't think your rights should be lost at all. Not everyone in the Restore the Vote Coalition feels that way, so I can't speak on behalf of the entire coalition. There are some, for example, the County Attorneys Association is a member of our coalition, and other, parole boards, and they might not be as willing to say that as we are. But I do know that is something that the ACLU is considering what we can do too. I will tell you, so the legislative I'll tell you a few minutes about the legislative outlook, and then we can have some more questions. So this bill has been trying to be passed for a long time. So the Restore the Vote Coalition formed about 4 or 5 years ago, and right up here at the front, when you're done, you can grab more information about the coalition, all the members. The League is a member. A lot of other groups are members of the coalition. And we started advocating for this almost 2005, so that's 13 years ago, was one of the first times there was a bill introduced to restore voting rights to people upon release. It's been introduced routinely by lots of different legislators. Bobby Doe Champion, Raymond Dean are some of the people who've kind of led the champion of the bill. Currently, we have both Republican, obviously I should say currently, the last 6 years or whatever it's been active, we've had both Republican and Democrat support for the bill. The closest we came to passing it was maybe about 3 or 4 years ago. It was the last time the House, and I should say the ACLU is nonpartisan. I know the League is also nonpartisan. This is just more a recounting of history. But the last time that the House and the Senate were democratically controlled was the last time it came close. It passed the House then, it passed the Senate. Every time the House has been democratically controlled by the Senate in the last couple of years, it has always passed the Senate, and the House has been the stickler. So we've tried to map out a path forward for how we can pass voting rights restoration for a number of years. Frankly, the biggest problem we have right now is the current Speaker of the House in Minnesota, Kurt Doubt, is not very willing to give the bill a hearing. That's kind of our biggest obstacle for moving forward, to be able to get a hearing, even though he has members of his party that support the bill, that are co-authors of the bill. that hasn't always been able to get us a hearing. We did have a hearing on it this past year in the House in one of the subcommittees. It did unfortunately not pass out of the committee, but it was a very close vote with one Republican voting for it. And one of the things that we hear, some of the things that we hear about why it shouldn't be passed are, things that we're working to try and counter. Things about, well, it's just part of the punishment, or, we don't want a murderer to vote. And kind of one of the things that we always say is, like, if we are ready, if we've decided that you are ready to live in the community, then for us, why does it matter what the offense is, right? Because the thing you want is you want everyone to be successful once they come out, right? Once they're released, once people are in custody, you want someone to be successful. You want them to do well. And so, that argument, at least for us, doesn't really, it's something that we're trying to kind of actively, push back against, this idea that only certain types of people, Virginia passed a law saying that if only nonviolent felonies could vote. And it was a very confusing system to enforce now. Now there's that with some, and well, does this count as a violent or nonviolent? And what about this one? And what about this one? And it's mass confusion. How many of you in here are election judges? A couple? One? Okay. Right? It's already, people right now have to go in and we're trying to register to vote that day of, and you'll get asked, well, are you off paper? And the most confusing thing is that some people don't know. They're like, well, I'm on paper for a gross misdemeanor, so, what's a felony? And it's already confusing. And then to institute a system like they have in Virginia makes it even more chaotic to try and figure out, especially in that moment when you're in the ballot box, when someone's trying to show up and register to vote, what are we supposed to do? This would make it so much cleaner to administer elections, because if they're showing up, clearly they're not in custody anymore, which means as far as felonies go, they're eligible, right? You still have the residency requirement or the citizenship requirement, but at least that piece, probably the most confusing piece, is very clear that they are eligible to vote. So we're going to keep pushing this bill, and I hope that all of you, if this is something you support of, will contact your legislator about. Who's the House and Senate member from this area? Do you have a couple? Peggy Flanagan? Wow.
The Senate is Ron Lance.
Both of them? Freiberg, okay. Okay. Most of those sound like have been strong leaders of this bill. And obviously you're losing Peggy Flanagan now, at least the ones who have Peggy Flanagan since she's on the governor's ticket. But yeah, make sure your legislator is supportive. If you have any friends who live in the next ring out of suburbs from here, that's where we really need to build our critical support, right? Because Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the inner ring suburbs are generally pretty supportive of it. And we have a fair amount of rural legislators that are supportive of it. It's the kind of outer ring suburban legislators that we have the most challenge of persuading that this is an important bill to carry. So that's kind of where we're trying to work to build our support and, talk to folks. And so we definitely love coming out in the community to try and build the support for, and also to make sure you talk to people in your network, in your neighborhoods, in your areas about why there's lots of issues we care about, right? I doubt anyone in here is a single issue voter. We all care about many different issues, but why voting, and specifically restoring voting rights, should be one of the lists that you talk about with your legislators. It's critical for the 51,000 people who can't vote, and frankly, I think it would make us a much better state overall if we knew that we were fully giving access to everyone to the ballot box. So what are some questions that folks have? Yeah.
No?
Yep, it's hot. It's hot now.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So if you look at all the people who have probation or parole for those really long tails, those 20-year, 10-year, whatever, from what you were saying, it doesn't sound like there's probably a common type of felony. It's just whatever deal was the prosecutor at the time. I mean, if you sorted them by type of felony, you wouldn't see any common thread.
There probably are some common threads, but if it was like a really violent one, then they're not going to give you. They're going to send you to prison. So it was like them lower tiered ones. It might be something like drinking and driving or something like that.
So the odds are good that if it's long like that, it's because you didn't serve prison time, so it's a lesser thing.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah, otherwise, it would be much more difficult for that prosecutor to push giving someone who did something really violent probation or parole as opposed to prison time. It'd be difficult for that prosecutor to justify that to whoever that county prosecutor was. So it's them lesser offenses typically that are going to get those extensive probationary periods.
Yeah, there's someone back there.
Hi, I'm Eric. So what does the Constitution say? I mean, when you talked about the potential of having, even allowing convicted persons who are in prison to vote, I'm inferring the Constitution has something to say about this, and is that
Yeah.
minimum sort of base?
Yeah, so the Minnesota Constitution wrote in 1857 that it bars voting from those convicted of treason or felony until restored to civil rights. But the Constitution doesn't specify when you are restored to civil rights. It doesn't say upon release from prison. It doesn't say after probation or parole. So when our lawyers have looked at this, and we've had multiple legal scholars look at it, it has said, well, we get to define then when you're restored to civil rights. The moment, it doesn't say when you have to be restored. And frankly, when the Constitution was written, because we didn't have a system of probation or parole existing at that time, if you were even trying to look at what the original intent of the framers are, it would be more logically applied as when you're released from custody, when you're no longer in jail or prison, that's when your voting rights have been restored. And that was the practice until probation was parole was established much later.
It makes sense. I mean, I'm driving cars, I'm paying taxes. I fly all around the country, that means I go through TSA. I'm in college, at universities, it makes total sense to look at me as someone who is moved towards restoration. Mm-hmm. Now, so I have to let my probation officer know, hey, I'm flying to another state, or I'm flying out of country, just so that they know. But outside of that, there are no additional barriers or restrictions.
Except for owning a gun. Except for having a gun.
Certainly can't have a gun.
Yes. Yeah. No. It's guns and voting are the two things.
Guns and voting, right? Yeah. So, yeah.
Just to follow up though, so what is the ACLU believe in terms of could their rights never be taken away if they're convicted of a felony?
Sure. So we would probably, if we wanted to be able to work towards that, your rights are never taken away. We would probably have to either potentially have an amendment to the Constitution. The other way that you can change anything is if you were to file a lawsuit to show disproportionality, disparate impact. Minnesota has laws barring discrimination based on race, and because of the disparities, that could be another way to do it. But it would be harder to get voting while you're in prison. I don't think you'd be able to do it. I can't say for sure, but I don't think you'd be able to do it through a simple legislative process.
And the position of the coalition is. So we're not pushing and advocating for full franchisement, people voting while in prison. That's not the position that we're taking. The position that we're taking is the moment someone is released back into community, that person should be able to vote and be fully a part of this democratic experience. That's the position of the coalition.
I'm sorry, one more small question. Any juvenile offenses affected at all?
Yeah. So. You can also jump in here too, but so for juveniles, it really depends, because if you commit a crime when you're 15 and you're brought to adult court, then yes, it would apply to you just like anyone else, right? And you also have EJJ, that's extended jurisdictional juvenile, and so that's a juvenile who would have committed an offense, and that young person will be on a probationary status up until the age, I think 24. Yeah.
It's either 21 or 24, but I believe it's 24. And so that means that young person who's on extended jurisdictional juvenile would be unable to vote.
But in Minnesota, you can be sent to adult court starting at age of 13, which means you could 14. Be 14. Mm-hmm. After 13, sorry. So that means people as young as 14 could have their voting rights taken away potentially forever, depending on if they were sent to. We have right now 9 juveniles in prison who were serving life sentences, who were committed when they were juveniles, right? And so these are people who not only are we throwing away their entire lives by keeping them locked up, but they will never, how many things are they being denied? And voting is just, another one of those.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
How many people do you believe are possibly not guilty, but because of the cost of being represented, they have a choice? And even if you can pay for some of it,
Yeah.
I mean, okay, you can plead either to this or that, or
Yeah.
3 years, or this or that,
Yeah.
or you can go to court
Yeah.
and take your chances.
And
it's
the
another
chances are you're looking at
$1 million
years.
for,
Right.
to get there, so you plead guilty, so it doesn't ruin your whole life, and you're not really guilty.
Right.
And that affects your, as well, just because of the cost of having representation. in
Yeah,
court.
we believe that happens. I mean, you're faced with the statutory defined amount for whatever the charge is. Let's say it's 25 years. And that's what you're looking at. You're looking at, on a sheet of paper, saying 25 years, and yet here they're saying, okay, 10 years probation. Now, a lot of people in those situations don't know that those statutory maximums, people rarely ever really get those. But like, who's sitting and explaining that while you're in the county jail? And how would any of those guys really even know? We have the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commissions, which actually better determines what a person would be sentenced to if convicted for whatever crime. But the statutory language is like really stark and like really aggressive and really intimidating. And so, yeah, when you're looking at the odds of, going through a long judicial process and then potentially serving years in prison versus just plead to this thing and just get back to life. When you're looking at those, a lot of people, for whatever reason, take the deal.
Yeah. And I
It's
don't
really
know-
predatory.
And I don't know if there's been great studies that can say the exact number, but I know, for example, the Innocence Project has found scores of people who we know now have been wrongfully executed, right? Who were later found to be innocent because of DNA evidence. So we know not only are there decent numbers of people who are innocent, but we also have a lot of cases where it's almost like, well, clearly something happened, but it's the prosecutor's interpretation of what you did. So for in a criminalizing of a lot of other behavior, especially for women, and especially for women of color. For example, a woman named Natalie Pollard in St. Paul had a repeatedly abusive partner. Her partner showed up, tried to break into her house one night, break through the windows. She confronted him. He attacked her. She stabbed him to defend herself, was convicted of a felony murder sentence. Her conviction, or manslaughter, I can't remember if it was murder or manslaughter, I think murder. Her conviction was overturned because of problems with the prosecution, and the Ramsey County prosecutor tried again to do that, and because he knew she was going after her again, she took a plea deal to a felony.
And this is actually against an outcry in the community, like just a massive outcry. But the power of this county attorney, is so great that there could be a disregard to this, massive outcry and saying, this is clearly not right. Yeah. And so, that's one of the things that I'm happy that we are involved in, is helping to make some of the county attorneys a little bit more beholden to the people. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so great point. Excellent point.
I apologize, I might have missed this, but you mentioned that maybe a conviction could be strictly probation as the result of the sentence.
Yeah.
So if someone is put strictly on probation, then how would the restore the vote work?
Yeah.
As opposed to someone who is serving time and then on probation or parole?
Yeah, so just to be clear, someone who's on felony probation does not have to have gone to prison.
Yep.
The issue is if you're on felony probation or parole. you are unable to vote. Even if it's for 10, 20, however long you are on that probationary status, you can't vote. So the issue is what type of probation is it? Is it misdemeanor probation or is it felony probation, or gross misdemeanor probation? So if it's any of those, you can vote. If it's felony probation, you can't vote.
But the way we drafted the bill would make, the way that the bill is drafted makes it clear for those who are on felony probation, never went behind bars. The language is talking about the moment that you're restored is the moment they've decided that you're released. So it doesn't, when you say release, like you don't have to serve time behind bars. So the statute's written to make sure that even those people who don't actually serve time in prison, that it still counts basically once you walk out of the courtroom then, and they decide that what your sentence is to live in the community. And I, you know, a lot of people who may not spend any time in prison also likely spent some time in jail, either leading up to or before the trial.
Right.
Yeah. That's another question.
You mentioned that another potential avenue to change the law would be to bring a lawsuit and challenge the constitutionality based on disproportionate impact. Mm-hmm. You cited some pretty startling data about the disproportionate impact that it's having. Do you feel like the legislative pursuit is more likely to than a lawsuit?
I think we're exploring both avenues at the ACLU. I think anytime you can pass things legislatively, it really kind of speaks more to the power of the fact that this is something that's broadly wanted, as opposed to, a court decision that really depends on whoever is sitting on the Supreme Court. We would love to show that this is what the people of Minnesota want, but we also just want people to get reenfranchised, right? So the ACLU is kind of, trying to figure out which is the best, because the thing is, if you can't get a win at the courts, you have to kind of make that calculus. Are you more likely to get a win? Because this would be a pretty big case to bring that would likely go up to the Minnesota Supreme. I mean, it would go up to the Minnesota Supreme Court. There's no way it wouldn't reach the Minnesota Supreme Court. And so we are looking at both options, and we've really been pushing the legislative option because that's the elected people, and we want this to be the will of the people. But I think that would be an option if we can't get it through the legislative process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And as such, we're sitting down and, having conversations in the offices of Democrats, of Republicans, trying to make sure that there's cross-sectional support across all party lines. And we've been having, I would just say, some interesting conversations as we've been sitting down with some of our elected officials, to get this done. And I concur. I definitely agree with what Jana is saying, that the best route is the legislative route. But if we have to go another route, I definitely want to be one of the plaintiffs.
And I would say if any of you have heard of what's happening in Florida, I definitely encourage you to Google this tonight or sometime and spend a little bit of time, because Florida is one of the states, if you remember, that I mentioned permanently disenfranchises almost everyone. And right now in Florida, that means they have over 1 million people in the state of Florida who are permanently disenfranchised. 1 million, right? If for those of you who remember the 2000 Bush v. Gore election in Florida, what would have 1 million votes meant? That's a huge number, right? And right now, Florida has an amendment that will be on the ballot this November to restore voting rights to the place where we are at, not immediate upon from release, but to restore it to they're automatically restored upon ending your probation, parole, or conditional release. Wow. In order to get that passed, they have to get 60% of the vote. Right, Minnesota, it's 50% plus one, right, to pass a constitutional amendment. In Florida, it is one of the few places, so they are in a huge uphill battle, but they have an amazing campaign that's being led by folks who are impacted, who are really, bringing this forward. This is what we want, and I will tell you that the polling looks a little optimistic. It's not saying it's going to happen, but I'm saying it's not like they're behind by 30 points. Right? Now, 60 points is a huge thing, but if this campaign will win, if this campaign wins in a state like Florida, right, in a state that we know has had huge problems disenfranchising people, I really hope that this can really send a positive wave and message so we can get all states eventually to a consistency where, one day we all should be like Maine and Vermont, right? Like voting 1 year in prison, but at least upon release that you're able to vote. So, I would definitely encourage you. They have some great material, some powerful stories, and doing some great work down in Florida right now for that. Yeah.
Florida of all places.
Yeah. Well, when you have 1 million disenfranchised people, that is a huge amount. That is a huge amount.
I don't want to take time from another question that's right on topic because mine is a little bit off. But is ACLU explored or suppression of felony records after a certain time period or anything like that? Because it affects, I know we're here to talk about voting rights, but it affects so many other things in people's lives too. And if you ought to be able to be scot-free after some point, then all of those other things you should be able to participate in without that black mark on your record.
Yes. So I would say that's definitely something the ACLU supports. It hasn't been necessarily something we put a ton of. It hasn't been able to rise to the top of the list. When we look at what we want rise to the top of the list for a number of reasons, because we have a lot of things that we want to work on. There's been a number of bills that have been passed through the legislature and then through the commission, the Sentencing Guideline Commission. So for that process, you can actually go through the legislature and they set a lot of these things. Now, the Sentencing Guidelines Commission is where we've done a lot of work to try and at least limit some of the impact, like talking about reducing, sentences or reducing mandatory minimums, things like that. The legislature could look at more opportunities for expungement or hiding things or, whatever it may be. And part of it is always if we have a long list of 15 things we would love to see, and that would be, I think, one of them or whatever's, on that list. And you go to the bargaining table, right? You start out with 20 great things you want, and you end up with maybe 2. So I haven't heard of a huge movement with that one rising to the top. But I think that would definitely be something supportive. The one at the top right now is to cap probation or parole after 5 years.
10.
10.
Was
Okay.
it 5 or
I thought
10?
it was 5.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the one that seems to be moving forward a little quicker than hiding things or, making them kind of drop off your record after a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you have any other questions about other voting issues. When I was initially invited to come and talk, people had mentioned that there might be questions about automatic voter registration or anything else. So if there's any other voting issues that anyone here would have questions about in general, we'd be happy to answer those, or frankly about any of the other work that the ACLU works on too. Since we're here, we're happy to talk about more than just voting rights restoration while we're out here.
Yeah, like if you're wanting to volunteer, for instance, with the Smart Justice
Yes.
campaign, and we just so happen to have booth spaces available for the open streets in North Minneapolis, just saying, come and talk to me
And
afterwards.
if you haven't spread this out through the whole thing, because the date hasn't been officially announced yet, 'cause we're trying to finalize the location, but we, for example, the League of Women Voters Golden Valley and the ACLU are co-sponsoring a Hennepin County County Attorney Forum
We're
on
this close to
October
finalizing
on
the
October
date.
23rd. And both Freeman and Markazi, both the two candidates, have committed to going, which is great. I think it'll be the only county attorney candidate forum for the season. So, yeah. So that's on October 23rd. You can mark your calendars because hopefully you all will turn out to ask that. That is what we are trying to finalize at the last minute. Yes,
Yeah.
that is not. We're hoping North High School.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, there's still not the location set.
Correct.
Will be October 23rd, Hennepin County Attorney Forum, and co-sponsored by ALCU and Golden Valley League of Women Voters, and National Council of Jewish Women, and
Jewish Community Action,
Jewish Community Action. I think there's another.
Immigrant Law Center.
Thank you, Immigrant Law Center. Thank you.
Since you're opening up to other areas of ACLU work, I've been following in the paper as much as I can and through as many sources as I can. The children have been separated at the border and are still here, but I would love an update.
So it's unfortunately, never a happy update, with this because we still are 44 days out from when the Trump administration was supposed to reunite all the families separated at the border, and I think we still have a little under 200 children that are still not being reunited with their parents. And the biggest problem right now is that parents can't be found in Nicaragua, Guatemala, a lot of the places where they're at, because the Trump administration did not actually keep track of records very well of parents. So they don't even, or allegedly they say it's hard to track them down. And the thing that has been also challenging is the ACLU, brought the lawsuit to end this practice. And because we brought the lawsuit to end this practice, the Trump administration has tried to push off entirely on the ACLU the ability to reunite all the families, which we are obviously happy to do. And so we have lawyers who are part of it, right? We have lawyers who have flown to Guatemala, who are working there, who are there all the time. But it took weeks and weeks and weeks for the government to even turn over any information to us about the kids. Even though it could have, in theory, whatever little information they did have been done easily, they weren't doing it. And the courts have said the Trump administration still needs to lead the way to do this. But the ACLU has partnered with many local organizations to try and track down these parents. But the hardest thing is because of the poor record keeping, because of the fact that they were just dumped off a plane in other places, it's proving to be very challenging. And the government is not putting forth almost any effort to do this. So it's very troubling, very tragic. And when we do find, the families and we're able to reunite them, every victory is great, but the trauma that has been done to these children is still pretty traumatic.
Are you able to work with journalists at all? Because they seem to know things. And I just wondered whether there's sharing of that.
Yeah, I don't know how much, because the most of that work is out of our headquarters in New York, and so we're not kind of intimately familiar with all their partners or who journalists they might be partnering with. So I'm guessing they're working with whoever they can and trying to push the Trump administration as much as possible to give them every information. Or for the Trump, they could spend, if they were to put the full weight of the government versus the ACLU, which is tiny compared to what they have, they could find these families a lot quicker than we ever could.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If not, but thank you again for being here. It's been a very great discussion we have tonight. Again, if you want to help volunteer ACLU, I'm sure we'll be happy to take your names, information. Other than that, thank you so much for being here tonight. Great evening. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And feel free to come up and grab a coalition flyer.